Why does it take it so long for us to get back to the moon? This feels like something, and you and I were talking about this earlier, you were on the flight before Challenger exploded. If the Challenger accident never happens, are we on the moon 10 years sooner again?
No, because a lot had to happen. We had to focus that we need to be on the moon for much longer periods of time than just landing like we used to, stayed a couple days and left. This time we're going back, we're going to live there, we're going to learn there, we're going to develop new technologies, all of this so we can go to Mars with humans.
And the point, when you say we're going to live on the moon, are we living there as scientists, or is the goal we're going to end up living there?
I don't think in the short run we're going to live there. I think all of this is to develop where we may be living on other worlds. They may be floating worlds, they may be the surface of Mars, but this is just part of our push outward, our quest to explore, to find out what's out there in this universe.
This Artemis 1, it's been a big project in the making. It's taken years. There's the usual delays that you have. If this doesn't work, what does that mean for NASA?
Well, it's going to work. This first flight is a test. We test it, we stress it, we make this rocket and the spacecraft do things that we would never do with a human crew. The main purpose of the flight is to test the heat shield, because you can't test that in a lab.
Right.
So if the heat shield survives and does what it is expected to do, it's a successful test. So then we're ready in 2 years.
You've made it clear you're stress testing, meaning you may push this to the limit where it looks like an accident, but if it is, that's not necessarily a failure.
You can expect in a test flight that everything is not going to go as you expect it to. That's part of a test flight. That's part of, for example, developing aircraft. That's why you have a test pilot.
Right.
But we're pretty confident about this. And back to your question, why did it take 12 years? Well, originally the George Bush administration were going with a program that was way over budget.
Right.
It wasn't performing. President Obama canceled that, and then there was this churn of what to do. What you see is today a public-private partnership. And what you see is use of derivation of old parts of the rocket, but new technologies that are developed.
In the 60s and 70s, NASA did its own developing. They may have worked with other companies, but the companies were brought in to work for NASA. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Well, the companies were directly supervised by NASA. That's correct.
Now, this is a different setup, which culturally, you and I were talking earlier, culturally has been very hard to make happen. I mean, the best I could describe it to somebody, since we all went through the pandemic, is it sounds like you're trying to turn NASA into NIH, where it's the best of public and private together. There's going to be there's great government scientists, there's great private scientists. Is that what you're trying to do here?
Chuck, you hit it on the head. We're taking the best of the ingenuity, creativity in the corporate commercial world, and we've seen that. Now, when you put humans on those rockets, then NASA has to be all over it for safety. And the proof's in the pudding. The commercial crew to the International Space Station, the commercial cargo, much cheaper, because it was done without all the government constraints, but certainly the government requirements with regard to safety. Now you've got a combination of all. Right. You have the legacy of this big rocket being the government married up with the commercial lander. We're going into lunar orbit. We're going to have the crew transfer into a commercial lander.
And this is what Elon Musk's SpaceX is building, right?
SpaceX is doing it, and that's the first one. And we'll have other commercial landers in the future. But in developing those commercial landers because it's astronauts on it. NASA will be directing that.
NASA, for the last 30 years, has had a pretty successful partnership with Russia. Obviously, seems to look like it's going to split up. You have been Mr. Optimism. You're basically, it seems as if you're ignoring the rhetoric and assuming as soon as the war is over, things will go back to normal. Why are you so optimistic?
Well, let me say at the outset that what Putin has done in Ukraine is inexcusable. It's a slaughter. It's awful. But we were squared off against each other with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And yet we had American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts rendezvoused and docked and lived together in Apollo Soyuz in the midst of the Cold War, 1975. Mm-hmm. And that cooperative civilian space program relationship has continued all the way to this day. Mm-hmm. And despite the horrors that are going on in Ukraine, the professionalism, the relationship between the astronauts and the cosmonauts on board the International Space Station, as well as our two mission controls, one in Houston, one in Moscow, it doesn't miss a beat.
Still now, and there's still a crew exchange, correct?
And there's still a crew exchange. We've got an American astronaut going in 2 weeks on a Russian Soyuz rocket out of Baikonur, Kazakhstan. We've got a Russian female cosmonaut that's going on the next SpaceX that's going at the end of September. And so we keep that crew exchange going because we need both up there to operate the International Space Station.
All right, so let's turn to China. China's got an aggressive space program, and yet they seem to want nothing to do with anybody. Why is that?
Because they're very secretive. They don't want any kind of cooperation. They are non-transparent. Mm-hmm. They send their rockets to blast their ASAT, and they put all of this space junk that hinders.
Are they rushing things? Like when you watch them from afar, does it look like they're so insistent on trying to catch up to us that they're rushing it and cutting corners?
They're not cutting corners. They are good. And they've gotten a lot of the technology from everybody else.
Gotcha.
And as a result, they're very good. But we have offered, come on and start cooperating with us. They just don't want to do that. And you see that as evidence in our government-to-government relations with the Chinese. You see that, for example, they go out and they take the Spratly Islands and say, this is our territory.
Well, how are we going to prevent that from the moon? Because I was thinking about, is the moon going to turn into the South China Sea, where when China gets up there, we're up there? Is it going to be a land grab?
Well, we have to be careful about that. And that's what I've said all along, that we're in a space race. And we want to get to the South Pole of the moon where the resources are, where we think water is. If there's water, there's rocket fuel. Mm-hmm. And we don't want China suddenly getting there and saying, this is our exclusive territory. That's what they did with the Spratly Islands.
This moon program, this Artemis program, at the end of Artemis, do you expect to have, when we go to Mars, we're actually going to leave from the moon to go to Mars?
It is a possibility, because when we go to Mars with humans, we're going to have a new spacecraft. It'll be a new kind of propulsion. We can't go in 8-10 months and then stay on the surface for 2 years until the planets realign so that we could get back. We've got to go faster. So there's going to be a lot of development of new technologies. It is very possible that in lunar orbit is where we will service and build that spacecraft.
In fact, I've seen others predict this. Do you think the moon becomes home to heavy industrial type industry by the end of this century?
Well, for example, when we can ever develop fusion and it works, then we can harvest helium-3, which is on the surface of the moon, bring it back, and you've suddenly got a new form of energy that doesn't give out. And that could be the first industrialization of the moon.
Your biggest challenge as an administrator seems to be a challenge that really only two have pulled off in a long time, which is every successive presidential administration, usually if NASA's budget increased, the next one decides to decrease it. And it's usually not a party thing. It usually just matters. You prevented that from happening this time. I mean, this is a trip where Trump and Biden are both in the same, have the same position on space. Fair?
As was Obama before.
So your job's to make sure that by 25, the next administration doesn't think this is a bad idea. How do you convince them?
Well, I expect that administration to be a continuation of Joe Biden.
I hear you
there. But the same thing. NASA and our programs in space are multi-administration, multi-years. It's almost like building an aircraft carrier. You know, you start it, but it's going to take you 12 years. That goes through many administrations. So the good news is that both Republicans and Democrats support our civilian space program, and they have given us the go, and here it goes. There it is, right there.
Yeah, it's an impressive rocket. One last question on the Space Force. There's always been a military component. First the Army, then the Air Force, now Space Force. How has things changed? And does Space Force do launches that we're probably not aware of all the time?
For the defense of the country, both defensive and offensive, space has become the next battleground. It's the high ground. And what you've seen is not only satellites that give us early warning of any attack on Earth, including a nuclear attack, but you've seen the eyes and ears for us to have some certainty of what our adversaries are doing. Those assets now, because of the development of technology, are being challenged. And therefore, there are other assets that are developed in order to prevent those challenges. So space is the high ground that you want to retain. And that's why you're seeing, as you suggest, the Space Force becoming a major part of our national defense system.
And is this, I know President Biden said he didn't want to see essentially an escalation of military, sort of a military Cold War in space, but how do you prevent it?
Well, you do it the same way we have prevented World War III. You try to offer deterrence. You also try to offer intelligence so you know what each other are doing, and you try to keep communication. This is why in the civilian space program...
Boy, you're Chinese. It sounds like you don't have that with China.
Well, I was just going to say, this is why it's so important with the Russians to keep that civilian space cooperation going. Chinese space program is a different factor. It's a different challenge.
Is it all right with me to say that it looks like you're enjoying not being in politics anymore?
I love public service. This is just another avenue of public service for me.
I hear you, but there's a lot of, you don't have to deal with a lot of the negative anymore.
The truth is that NASA is really nonpartisan. NASA is bipartisan. It's supported by all, and it's my privilege to try to get us to the moon and get to Mars.
You going to go back up in space one more time?
Well, this is the time for the younger guys. This is the Artemis generation. We're not the Apollo generation.
So you're done, huh?
Well, I hope I'm helping make all this happen.
Well, you may know somebody that can get you on there.
Well, don't twist my arm too much, Chuck.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.